Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Jonathan, for organizing this event and all people showing up, and for Jackie and Chris for sort of setting up a lot of the framework. And, you know, Jackie talked about a conceptual framework about here's a tool that people can use to look at sea level rise and flooding and adaptation to those kinds of things. And then Chris said, well, here's a case study that we took, worked with BCDC on this framework, tested it out, saw if it worked, but from a purely hypothetical position where there wasn't any community engagement. And that really sets me up well to talk about what my work is. So, my name is Yair. That's my name. It's kind of an unusual name, but never hesitate to ask again. And my job currently with the BCDC is that I'm technically, I guess I'm a policy and data analyst, but my work that I'm doing right now is doing policy development, and specifically, I have been tasked with updating the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan, which is a policy that applies specifically to the Suisun Marsh. Let's see if my slides want to cooperate. So today I'm just going to talk a little, there might be some overlap, from what Jackie presented in terms of BCDC and what they do. Talk a little bit, let you know a little bit of information about the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan itself. Tell you a little bit of information about a stakeholder meeting that BCDC held almost a year and a half ago, and then talk about the next steps. This is a map that you kind of already saw, but I think it bears repeating. BCDC, or the San Francisco Bay Development and Conservation Commission. I'm missing it up right now. Bay Conservation Development Commission. Yeah, no, that's true. We're a state agency that our geographical jurisdiction extends from basically the Golden Gate Bridge to the west, all the way to the east there, which is basically the eastern end of the Suisun Marsh, or kind of where the delta and the marsh meet. But it's basically a line. It's an artificial line mostly. And so that's our geographical framework. We regulate development in the bay, and within 100 shoreline band, there are different approaches. And in that capacity, we work in some sense like a permitting agency. If people have questions about developers and what can we do, or things like that, if there's a conflict between developers and the commission has a set of rules and policies which are aimed, just like Jackie was saying, it was designed, developed to protect, to conserve the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay, as well as interact with developers and see how development. So there are some co-equal goals that the commission has. And that's generally, initially its role was to minimize fill, right? Because the bay was getting filled in, and people were concerned that eventually there will be no bay, just like the images that Jackie showed, where there would just be two narrow channels and everything else would be infill, development, and housing, who knows. So generally the development of San Francisco Bay, or BCDC's guiding documents basically say that any development needs to minimize fill and is only restricted to water-oriented uses in the bay and along the shoreline. And another one of our major directives is to ensure continued public access, to maximize feasible public access to these resources. And somebody mentioned public trust earlier. Public trust doctrine is certainly a part of how BCDC and other regulatory agencies interact with and deal with development in the bay and conservation in the bay. So those are definitely things that come into play. Just wanted to, we've seen some images of the marsh today. I thought it would be worthwhile. This is an image that was produced by somebody else. So I think we see Susun there in the background of the picture. I wish we had pointers, but part of the point of this image is to show that it's a really complex habitat. There are tidal channels, there are sloughs, there's open water, there are wetlands, there are tidal wetlands, there are managed wetlands, there are these upland transition zones. I don't know if you can see them. You can't, okay. There's probably a tool for that. And so it's a complex habitat very complex landscape. It's, it's a roughly 85,000 acres of tidal marsh, managed wetlands, and waterways. And it's one of the largest remaining wetlands around the San Francisco Bay Area. It also includes more than 10%, of California's remaining wetlands area are here in Suisun Marsh. So it's a really important place. Managing this area, protecting it, is complicated because of all these complex habitats and because of the many, many regulatory agencies that interface with this area. I'll talk about that a little bit later. There's so many agencies and departments, both federal, local, state. It's quite a challenge, I think, to really deal with this. Additionally, in addition to the habitat complexity and regulatory complexity, there are many, many wildlife species that rely on the Suisun Marsh. So it's, the marsh is a wildlife habitat of national and I would say also international importance. It's a very important flyway for many migratory birds. State and federally, there are many species that are endangered or threatened that live in the marsh and rely on the marsh. Something that I know that we all know that Suisun Marsh is kind of has a legacies as waterfowl and the duck hunting clubs that have been around for a long time, which I would say, in large part, the presence of these duck clubs is one reason why the marsh is not filled in and developed, because these duck clubs have a very strong interest and influence in maintaining an open habitat that's suitable for a lot of wildlife. So that, that's a little bit of again, some more information from what I understand perspective about the Suisun Marsh itself. The complex habitat, all the wildlife species that rely on it, all the complexity of interests and regulatory agencies that overlay it. I'll tell you a little bit about BCDC and the Suisun Marsh right now. So BCDC, is charged in protecting or conserving the entire Bay Area. However, in 1974, there was also, through discussions and conversations, there was an understanding that Suisun Marsh within the Bay is a unique area that maybe deserves and requires its own set, its own layer of understanding, attention, and regulation. So there was the Suisun Marsh Preservation Act, came out in 1977. The jurisdiction of BCDC within the marsh was defined just geographically, a little bit in 1974. But so we have the Suisun Marsh Preservation Act of 1977, under which is now housed or located the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan that was promulgated and finalized in 1976. Sorry, my days up a little bit. Under the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan, it was, at the time when the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan was designed and developed, it was really, with conversations and lots of interactions with local jurisdictions, it was really quickly understood that local jurisdictions have already been on the ground doing really important work. And so there was an important understanding and need to say there are these other agencies, such as Suisun City, Fairfield City, and others that have already been doing work in the Suisun Marsh. So under the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan, these 7 other local jurisdictions have their own what's called the Local Protection Plan, which need to be consistent with all the other laws, the Protection Plan and the Protection Act, but each city or each jurisdiction has their own needs and their own flavor, their own community input, when we want to do this, but we don't want to do that. So that's why the cities, again, such as Suisun City, the Suisun Resource Conservation District, and others have their own protection plans. So that's basically the regulatory framework, the framework of how BCDC regulates or what our regulatory authority is within the Suisun Marsh. This might be a map. It's kind of messy. I can see that, but it has some important information. Again, we have Suisun City up there towards the top, and the important things I think to take away from here is that the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan itself also has these geographical boundaries. So you see the green line, green dashed line, is what's called the primary management area, which is where BCDC has the regulatory authority to issue permits. The pink or purple line, including this green line, is it's just up there in more upland areas, is what's called the secondary management area, and that's where local jurisdictions such as Suisun City or Solano County, whatever city or agency has jurisdiction, they have primary permitting authority, and BCDC acts as an appellate jurisdiction. So if something, if development goes up, through a process of saying, we want to appeal this project that the city authorized or something like that, then it would go to BCDC. And then all these white areas, those are all the privately owned managed wetlands duck clubs. So those they work mostly through the Susumu Resource Conservation District, which is one of those entities that holds a local protection plan, right? So they help all these duck clubs manage and operate their day-to-day, year-to-year projects. So a little bit more about what's going on here in terms of geography. What does BCDC have to do with it? How does that interface with all the other jurisdictions and some things of that nature? So right now, or not right now, but for the past couple of years, I should say, BCDC has undertaken a big process to update the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan. It was adopted in 1976 and has not been comprehensively updated since that time. There have been some small updates, here and there, and as we know, lots of things have changed since the 1970s. Sea level rise, which is a big topic of this event, the sustainable Solano, the floodwalks, and our adapting to rising tides, and Chris's work. Sea level rise is a big one. There's new technology that has come along. Solar panels were not really considered in the 1970s, or wind turbines, things of that nature. So that has changed. The area has seen a huge growth in population. Politics changed. A lot of things have changed. And so, again, about 2 years ago, the BCDC started undertaking this process of updating this plan. It was done, and this is, started pre-COVID times. So there were many meetings and many conversations with stakeholders, and we've had some delays, but we're trying to take it up again. And I have to say, the delays were partly part of due to COVID. We also had staff changes and other delays, so that's why it's kind of taken such a long time to restart this. But so the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan, we need to update it, but it has some very specific mandates. And the main objective of the plan has a very well-defined objective. There's two of them. One of them, they're to preserve and enhance the quality and diversity of Suisun Marsh aquatic and wildlife habitats, and to assure retention of upland areas adjacent to the marsh and uses compatible with its protection. I thought it would be worthwhile reading this out. Really, the Marsh Protection Plan was designed to protect the wildlife habitats, the ecological services that the marsh provides, and to protect also the uses that are adjacent to the marsh in such a way that would ensure protection of the marsh itself. So that was the goal of the protection plan. I also have to say, even though it's not in the title itself, again, I want to reiterate, public access is also a really important part of the Suisun Protection Plan and BCDC. So again, we have these goals that exist side by side that we really need to pay attention to. The protection plan itself is split up into 7 different topics. And again, these are the topics, the headings that were conceived of back in the 70s. So environment is a big one, water supply and water quality, of course, obviously really important in this area. There are natural gas resources in the Suisun Marsh. So those are also, there's a section in the protection plan to talk about how natural gas resources can be extracted, transported, shipped, all kinds of things like that. So that's an element that they looked at very closely. Utilities, facilities, recreation and access. Like I said, it's an important part of the Suisun Protection Plan. Water-related industries and land use and marsh management. And in some ways, the marsh management is where all those duck flows come in, for example. So this is animated. I'll just do it really quickly. We had a first meeting in 2020, or February 2020, started by a person that worked there before I joined. And at least all these different entities were included in the conversations. We started the conversations with other regulatory agencies, federal ones like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Reclamation, a lot of the holders of these local protections plans, such as Solano County, Suisun City, Fairfield, also had input from California Fish and Wildlife and from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USGS. So a lot of people have some sort of interest in this area or some mandate to ensure, to regulate some aspect of this area. So it was a big meeting. A lot of people came in. Initially, first part of the meeting was describing some of this history that I'm telling you about today, and about our policies and some of the changes that have taken place in the last 40 years, just like I did this morning. And then the later half of the workshop was spent in small working groups, talking about, having that community, although it was the regular, I understand it was not the local people or the development or the business community in the area, it was all these other actors, but it was the start of the process of getting input from all these agencies and partners about what are your interests in the marsh, what are your concerns, what are your requirements, and generating ideas and topics for how do we even start this process. So in the presentations that Jackie and Chris gave, there's that community engagement section before you start doing all the other steps. So that's the step that we are engaged in right now. And the question that was posed at that meeting was, how do we continue to preserve a functional marsh? If the goal, if the mandate of the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan is to protect and enhance the wildlife habitat, the question is then, how do we continue to do this going forward? How do we protect a functional marsh which provides all these benefits? Wildlife, habitat, sea level rise potentially, flood protection, mitigation for greenhouse gas emissions, all kinds of questions. So that was what the first question was about. We had, we got a lot of feedback, we synthesized, we're working on it. And what comes next is mostly, what comes next for me and for us is this kind of interaction, right? We want to come back again and talk to the community. This time we are reaching out to organizations like Sustainable Solano. We're reaching out again to other community-based organizations and other community members. We're trying to reach as many people as possible, given our limited staff, which is me, to work on this entire project. And Jackie helps; she's great help. But point is that at this point in time, given our staffing and other job workloads, we cannot update the entire plan wholesale. It's just too much, it's too big. So part of the input that we're seeking from communities is, what of those topics are most important to you? Are there new topics that you'd be interested in? Again, the sea level rise, there's not a category for sea level rise in the initial plan because there wasn't a thing back then. So is that something that we want to put in there? Is public access the thing that's most important to people? Responding to sea level rise. All the things, again, very tying into Sustainable Solano's floodwalks and Jackie and Chris's work and Anthony's work. If what happens in the marsh has impacts on what happens outside the marsh. It has impacts on what happens to Susun City. So, Chris talked about these extreme weather events. Somebody had asked about droughts. Yes, we have droughts now, but we might have floods later. Earlier snow melt, so in wet years, the snow melts sooner or faster, we get this big flood. The Suisun Marsh itself could have impacts. What we do in the Suisun Marsh would have impacts on what, or would interact with floodwaters. Will the Suisun Marsh be able to grow together with sea level rise, or will it get inundated and become open water? Those are all questions that we are, tackling and wondering about, and a lot of what we do depends on community input. So, I really appreciate Sustainable Solano reaching out to us. We're working with them as an organization that's already on the ground and has members, and we will be working with them, again, to maybe reach out to you or other people in the community to have more community engagement opportunities. Again, COVID allowing, we might have meetings in person, we might meet them over Zoom, we'll have questionnaires, we'll have feedback, we'll have a lot of conversations, which we will then take in, process, and again, to design and come back to the community, so a lot of conversations back and forth, and come up with a list of a prioritized list. What do we tackle first? What's our first goal of updating the community, the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan? So that's, in a nutshell, that's where we are right now, and that's where we're going forward, moving forward with this. So my presentation, I think, was kind of short, but it was just, want to give you the framework of what BCDC can do in the marsh, and I see you raising your hand, so, yes?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Something I appreciate you mentioned here was there's a natural gas well out there, and there's even a permit that you would put another natural gas well out there, and you mentioned renewable energy as something that really hasn't been included.
Right.
So I really appreciate that. If we're going to have natural gas wells out in the marsh, can we have some solar panels, maybe some sort of wind farm as well? So I really appreciate that concept.
Yeah, so it's a question of how does development, how does meeting these new green infrastructure, green resources, how do they manifest in the marsh? Is it like, go ahead and do whatever you want? Or it's like, well, you need to go ahead and do whatever you want, but we need to, given BCDC's layer of protection with our own sort of requirements, sure, you can do that, but you need to provide public access, or you need to make sure that the functional properties of the marsh stay intact. And we're BCDC is just one of many agencies that are responsible for that. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, California Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources. So, some of these questions, like how do we move forward with all the things that are really important to people right now? And that will inform how we then update the protection policy for the Susumu Marsh itself. Yeah?
Another great presentation. My biggest concern is Susun. It sounds to me like it's such a small stakeholder on the region of the Susun Marsh. My concern is living in Susun, all these grants are going to go to preserving the marsh, which it should. But I think we have to understand, unless we get involved as citizens, the topic of flood control in the city of Susun is another subject. And we need to somehow merge those two, that we're part of the solution. That's going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, I can appreciate that there are many levels, unfortunately or fortunately, as you may see it, there are so many different levels of where you can have an impact and where your vote goes. And we're a small city in a large region. I think Chris probably knows the citation off the top of right then. But the reason that there came out a study that showed that it has to be a regional approach. If one location in the bay takes on certain measures to protect from flooding, it's going to have impacts on the other side of the bay. Also, the work that he did, how you address the marina, if you, let's say, do hard sea level rise mitigation or adaptation, right? You put seawalls. That's going to change the wave action, it's going to change flows, it's going to affect the areas that are greener, softer protection areas. So Suisun City is one player, and hopefully people do get involved and see what they want to see. Also understanding that Suisun Marsh Protection Plan, for example, because that's what I'm working on, is the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan. It doesn't talk about what happens in the Capital Corridor, it doesn't happen, it's not relevant to what happens on Highway 37, so there are limitations and also great and important ways that all these policies and regulations and zoning requirements, they do interact and overlap, and that's, I think, part of that.
Might be cheaper just to give everybody, each of us, a rowboat.
that might be, I don't know if the private businesses in Susumu, they might say, no, I want something different, right? So that's where the conversation comes in. Yeah.
It seems to me that the duck clubs could have a major role in this going forward. Do you get a sense from them if they are kind of on board with that? Like, I know it's a big question with a lot of different answers, but do you get a general sense that duck clubs are kind of aware of sea level rise and the role that they can play in this?
I definitely know that they're aware of sea level rise. I couldn't speak for the duck club's individual owners and what level of understanding they have that their managed wetlands can have in all this aspect. I can tell you that it's public knowledge, the Susumu Regional Conservation District a couple of months ago, they adopted a whole set of new management plan, individual management plans. And as part of those management plans for each duck club. So those also haven't been updated since the 70s. Again, there have probably been some small changes since then, but one of the major changes that they adopted, and we're still in the process of bringing it to BCDC for certification, is allowing managers a more flexible way of approaching the management of each property. So it used to be, I think, and I might be a little off on this, but they say, for this club, you can mow the grass to this height, and that's it. That's what you do at this, during these months. Right now, what they've done is provided them with more scientific data and tools and allowing them to say, well, in a drought year, we might want to do this. To deal with sea level rise, you might want to adjust to that. If it's a combination of, flood year and sea level rise and king tides, so it's more of an adaptive management. That's the term, adaptive management approach. So they're aware of sea level rise, they have tools to deal with it. I'm not sure if each one understands the depth or the intensity of what they can do in order to affect, to deal with all the things that are coming. And we're also in conversation with them. They're also a part of this community that will have input into how we update the Suisun Marsh Protection Plan.
Yeah, because that map that you showed looks like they're covering about 90% of the marsh.
They have,
It's huge.
yeah, they do have a lot of the marsh is currently,
Yeah.
a lot of these other areas, however, they're being restored. So the Department of Water Resources is restoring a lot of these places. Again, I'm still feel kind of new. I've only been with the agency for a year, but there are wildlife and there are federal, state agencies that are restoring a lot of these marshes and tidal marshes, and those are also open. They are held by public agencies, so they have a different set of regulations or even mandates of what do we do? What does it mean to have land held in the public agency? But yes, they do have. There are a lot of them, and they are, majority of the marsh, I would say, the primary management area is managed wetland under private ownership. Yeah,
Thank you.
for sure. Okay, thank you so much.